Los Angeles is a wonderful place to live. I think it might be a better place to write about. It's got so much going for it. It's got beauty, it's got a magnificent climate of creativity and of weather. It's got tremendous diversity in the people who are born here and the people who come here to live. Yet underlying all of that is this dark sense, this sense of chaos and danger. And it is in that scene where I work. That's the line between good and evil, between chaos and order, between the haves and have-nots, between safety and danger. And it is in that area that I put a detective, Harry Bosch, and it becomes his job to sort things out, to make it safe for us.
It was midnight when he came back inside. The place smelled of her perfume and his own guilt. He put Frank Morgan's Mood Indigo on the CD player, stood there in the living room without moving, just listening to the phrasing on the first solo, a song called Lullaby. Bosch thought he knew nothing truer than the sound of a saxophone. Sleep was not a possibility. Bosch knew this. He stood on the porch looking down at the carpet of lights and let the chill air harden his skin and his resolve. For the first time in months, he felt invigorated. He was in the hunt again. He let everything about the case pass through his mind and made a mental list of people he had to see and things he had to do. Driving down out of the hills, he did not pass another car until he reached Cahuenga. He headed north and got on the Hollywood freeway at Barham. The freeway was crowded, but not so that traffic was slow. The cars moved northward at a steady clip, a sleekly moving ribbon of lights. Out over Studio City, Bosch could see a police helicopter circling, a shaft of white light cast downward on a crime scene somewhere. It almost seemed as if the beam was a leash that held the circling craft from flying high and away. He loved the city most at night. The night hid many of the sorrows. It silenced the city, yet brought deep undercurrents to the surface. It was in the dark slipstream that he believed he moved most freely, behind the cover of shadows. Like a rider in a limousine, he looked out, but no one looked in. There was a random feel to the dark. The quirkiness of chance played out in the blue neon night. So many ways to live and to die. You could be riding in the back of a studio's black limo, or just as easily the back of the coroner's blue van. The sound of applause was the same as the buzz of a bullet spinning past your ear in the dark. That randomness, that was L.A. There was flash fire and flash flood, earthquake, mudslide. There was the drive-by shooter and the crack-stoked burglar, the drunk driver and the always-curving road ahead. There were killer cops and cop killers. There was the husband of the woman you were sleeping with, and there was the woman. At any given moment on any given night, there were people being raped, violated, maimed, murdered, and loved. There was always a baby at his mother's breast, and sometimes a baby alone in a dumpster. Somewhere.
Somebody once said in the newsroom where I used to work that Los Angeles was a sunny place for shady people. I try to remember that when I write about this place. I try to use the atmospherics to show shadings of character and story. I think it's important.
I drove back to the valley, taking the Sepulveda Pass and catching the first brutal wave of rush hour. It took me almost an hour just to get to Mulholland Drive. At that point, I jumped off the freeway and drove west along the crest of the mountains. I watched the sun drop behind Malibu and leave a burning sky in its trail. At the low angles, the sun often reflected off the smog caught in the bowl of the valley, and it turned brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. It was like some sort of reward for putting up with having to breathe the poisoned air every day. This evening, it was mostly a smooth orange color with wisps of white mixed in. It was what my ex-wife used to call a creamsicle sky when she watched sunsets off the back deck of the house.
Depending on the smog or the traffic on any given day, LA is either an autotopia or an autodystopia. Most often it's the latter. I try to show both sides of it. Most often I write about this character, Harry Bosch, who lives in a house that overlooks a freeway. He has the constant hissing and sound of traffic coming through his windows. It's sort of the motif of his life, because it's the motif of this city.
The Carrera effortlessly climbed through the Mulholland curves from Cahuenga up to the crest of the Santa Monica Mountains. At the Hollywood overlook, she pulled off the road, killed the engine, and got out. She stepped to the railing at the edge and looked down at the shell of the Hollywood Bowl far below. Her eyes moved out from the bowl across Hollywood toward the spires of downtown. The smog was heavy, had a pinkish-orange tint to it, but somehow it didn't look all that bad. "Nice view," he said from behind her. "Sometimes," she said.
This is Sunset Boulevard. It runs from the barrios to the beaches. It goes by our great halls of education. It goes by the mansions and the movie studios. It goes by the hospitals and the homeless encampments. It encompasses all of LA. It does what a good detective must do, and that is be at home in the world, no matter where that world is. He must be able to move fluidly through all levels of society. I think that's also one of the reasons people like to read stories about detectives, because the detective can take them on this trip through all levels of society.
The Los Angeles car czar and his wife lived off of Mulholland Drive in an exclusive development called the Summit. It was a gated and guarded neighborhood of side-by-side millionaires with spectacular homes that looked down from the Santa Monica Mountains and north across the basin of the San Fernando Valley. Once inside the home, Bosch and Edgar were led to a living room that was bigger than Bosch's entire house. They were told that the Kincaids would be with them shortly. They stepped to the windows, which they were meant to do. The rich kept you waiting so you could feel free to admire all that they had. "Jetliner views," Edgar said. "What's that?" "It's what they call it when you are this high up, jetliner views." Bosch nodded. He could see across the valley to the Santa Susana Mountains. The view, however, could not be called beautiful. A heavy layer of smog stretched across the basin. They were high enough in the Kincaid house to be above it, or so it seemed. A voice came from behind them. "I know what you're thinking." Bosch turned around. A smiling man had entered the living room. Sam Kincaid, the car czar. "But you know what?" Kincaid continued. "I don't mind seeing the smog. My family's been selling cars in this city for 3 generations, since 1928. That's a lot of years and a lot of cars. That smog out there reminds me of that."
This is an old red car station, part of a transportation system that was replaced by the freeways decades ago. On the day I first arrived in Los Angeles in 1987, the first day I was here, I was given a gift by the city that turned out to be very valuable to me in terms of my storytelling and writing books. There had been a robbery, a bank robbery. The suspects used all-terrain vehicles. They went in at this tunnel entrance, went in about a mile where they connected with a stormwater tunnel and took that basically into downtown to get into proximity of the bank that they were going to hit. They drilled up or dug up into the vault and spent a whole weekend in there popping open safe deposit boxes and getting away with it. It's been many years now and the case has never been solved. They obviously closed up this entrance, but they've never caught the guys who did it. It was a big crime and a big story, and being a reporter, I had access to the detectives on the case. I also had access to the details, and that's where the gift came in, because a couple years later is when I really used all these details. I had been in Los Angeles for a few years, and I thought I was ready to start writing some crime fiction about it, and I used the details of the robbery in my first novel, The Black Echo. I'm not a big believer in coincidence or serendipity, but I often have to think about that day I arrived here and this kind of dropped in my lap. What if I had come a week later? Would I have still gotten the story that became my first novel? I don't know. And so it's something to think about.
The tunnel alternately curved left and then right for 50 yards, causing Bosch to become confused about his location. At times he could hear the rumble of traffic, making the tunnel sound like it was breathing. Trying to lower the noise of his own breathing, Bosch moved forward. The pipe smelled like a wet towel, and the air was damp enough to put a film on his skin. The sound of traffic rumbled from somewhere nearby. There was the sound of sirens. He felt that the pipe was on a gradual downward slope. He was going deeper underground.
Los Angeles is like that old friend of yours who has a good heart and means well and wants to do well, but somehow always seems to come up short of the mark. You love that guy just the same, but you always sort of wish that one time he would put it all together. That one time when he reaches for the brass ring, he'd actually get it.
The drive north on the Pacific Coast Highway was slow but nice. The highway skirted the ocean, and the sun hung low in the sky over Pierce's left shoulder. It was warm, but he had the windows down and the sunroof open. When he got to the first stretch of Malibu, and his view of the coast was stolen by the houses crowding the ocean's edge, he slowed down and watched for Zeller's house. He didn't have the address, and the houses were jammed side to side and all looked the same. No lawns, built right to the curb, flat as shoeboxes. He was saved by the sight of Zeller's black-on-black Jaguar. He pulled a U-turn and parked behind it. Inside the house, they moved across the beach flooring toward the view. In a house like this, it was an automatic reflex. You gravitated to the view, to the blue-black water of the Pacific. Pierce saw light misting out on the horizon, but not a single boat. As they got close to the glass, he could look down through the deck railing and see the swells rolling in. A small company of surfers in multicolor wets sat on their boards and waited for the right moment. Pierce felt an internal tug. It'd been a long time since he'd been out there. He'd always found the waiting on the swells, the camaraderie of the group, to be more fulfilling than the actual ride in on the wave. "Those are my boys out there," Zeller said. "They look like Malibu High teenagers," Pierce replied. "They are, and so am I." Pierce nodded. Feel young, stay young. Common Malibu life ethic.
More so than the origin of evil and crime and violence, I think I'm interested in how random it can be, especially in this city. The first big murder case I worked on when I came here as a reporter started in this neighborhood. It involved a man named Roland Comtois. He was an ex-convict and drug addict who had spent more time in prison than not. And he had become an urban nomad. He lived in a camper. By day, he would commit small crimes and score drugs, and at night, he had to find a street to park that camper. Every night, a different street. One night, it was this street. Also in this neighborhood were two girls, lifelong best friends, who were visiting each other. And when it was time to go home, one walked the other one home. And they came across Roland Comtois and his camper. Comtois took the girls up into these hills. He injected them with drugs, assaulted them, and shot them, leaving them for dead. But one girl survived, and she walked out of these hills with a bullet in her head, but was able to give the police the information they needed to arrest Comtois. It was a terrible crime. It destroyed two families. It hurt the neighborhood where those girls were from. And once again, it underlined that edge that is Los Angeles, the sense of shared danger, of random violence, the idea that something can happen at any point, anywhere. What stuck with me was the dedication of the detectives on the case. These guys weren't detached like cops I had seen on other cases. This one hurt them. It meant something to them. It took a piece of them. and they are absolutely relentless in their pursuit of the person who committed these crimes.
All the houses in the neighborhood were one of three basic designs. It was one of the cookie-cutter victory neighborhoods that had sprung up after World War II in the city, with affordable homes for returning servicemen. Now you'd probably need to be making a general's pay to buy in. Each lawn had a little tin sign planted in it. They were from 3 or 4 different home security companies, but they all said the same thing: armed response. Sometimes Bosch thought the Hollywood sign should be taken down off the hill and replaced with those 2 words.
When I write about Los Angeles, I feel like I am so lucky because my palette is overflowing with paint with many different colors. There are so many things to write about here, so many different places to go. You know, you have the desert, you have the mountains, you have the ocean. And after 14 books now, I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of what I could write about when it comes to Los Angeles.
Lockridge and McCaleb took a succession of freeways from Whittier until they reached the Antelope Valley Freeway, which would finally take them to the northeast corner of the county. Lockridge drove one-handed most of the way, holding a harmonica to his mouth with the other hand. It didn't give McCaleb much of a feeling of safety, but it cut out the meaningless banter. As they passed Vasquez Rocks, McCaleb studied the formation and pinpointed the spot where the body had been found that eventually led to his knowing Jay Winston. The slanted and jagged formation caused by tectonic upheaval was beautiful in the afternoon light. The sun was hitting the front rock faces at a low angle and throwing the crevices into deep darkness. It looked beautiful and dangerous at the same time. "Ever been there, Vasquez Rocks?" Lockridge asked after tucking the harmonica between his legs. "Yeah. Neat place. It's named after a Mexican desperado who holed up in the crevices about 100 years ago after robbing a bank or something. So many places to hide in there, they could never find him, and he became a legend." McCaleb nodded. He liked the story. He thought about how his histories of places were so different. They always involved bodies and blood work. No legends, no heroes.
This is Woodrow Wilson Drive in the Hollywood Hills. This is the street where Harry Bosch lives. I first came to this place the way I came to many places in Los Angeles, as a reporter on a story. In this case, it was a murder story. When I first got here, there was a body laying in the street right here, a woman. She was a night nurse who worked for an elderly man down the street here. And what had happened was she had finished a night of work and was heading home in her car. And what she found here was a body herself. There was a man lying in the street. Being a nurse, she jumped out of her car to see if this person needed help. And as she approached the man, he turned over and with a knife stabbed her in the chest, and she died right here. This is another one of the neighborhoods in Los Angeles where these kind of things aren't supposed to happen, but yet they do. It's that random edge of Los Angeles again. When I came up here to work on the story, I happened to be also putting together the characteristics of Harry Bosch and picking out the details of his life, where he would live, what he would be like. And I immediately gravitated towards this place. Behind these houses are $1-million views of Los Angeles, of the Cahuenga Pass and of the Universal Studios and the skylights that sweep across the sky at night. And I just realized that this would be a perfect place to put Harry Bosch, because what I try to do in the books is have him contemplate the city and his place in it. And the perfect place to do that is the back deck of his house.
Woodrow Wilson Drive winds counterclockwise around and up the side of the Hollywood Hills. The cracked patchwork asphalt never wide enough at any point for 2 cars to pass without a cautious slowing. Going up, the homes on the left crawl vertically up the hillside. They are old money, solid and secure, Spanish tile and stucco. To the right, The newer houses fearlessly swing their wood frame rooms out over the brown brush arroyos and daisies in the canyon. They are balanced on stilts and hope, and cling as tenuously to the edge of the hill as their owners do to their positions at the studios down below. Bosch's home was fourth from the end on the right side. His home was a wood-framed one-bedroom cantilever, not much bigger than a Beverly Hills garage. It hung out over the edge of the hill and was supported by 3 steel pylons at its midpoint. It was a scary place to be during earthquakes, daring Mother Nature to twang those beams and send the house down the hill like a sled. But the view was the trade-off. From the back porch, Bosch could look northeast across Burbank and Glendale. He could see the purple-hued mountains past Pasadena and Altadena. Sometimes he could see the smoke and orange blaze of brush fires in the hills. At night, the sound of the freeway below softened, and the searchlights at Universal City swept the sky.
This is the Hollywood Police Station, the place where Harry Bosch works. Until recently, the Los Angeles Police Department was probably the most vilified police department in the country, maybe even the world. It seemed that not a month went by that there wasn't some new blemish on the record or some new scandal. From Rodney King and the riots to the debacle of the O.J. Simpson case, it seemed that something was always going wrong. In reality, it was a shame. It made it harder for the good people of this department to do a good job. It made it harder to live in this community. But when it came to fiction, it was inspirational. It was grist for the mill. I mean, I was taking this character, Harry Bosch, and putting him in this world where it seemed the odds were stacked against him, where it seemed the biggest obstacles he had to overcome were within his own department. When you're writing, you're always trying to raise the stakes for your character, and here I had the stakes very high from the get-go. It was built into this department that I was writing about.
Bosch drove over to Central Division and found an open parking space at the front curb. For a while he sat in his car watching 2 trustees from the lockup washing the painted mural that stretched along the front wall of the bunker-like police station. It was a depiction of a nirvana where black and white and brown children played together and smiled at friendly police officers. It was a depiction of a place where the children still had hope. In angry black spray paint along the bottom of the mural, someone had written, "This is a damnable lie." Bosch wondered whether someone from the neighborhood or a cop had done it. It was the same old story that every cop knew. The citizens want their police to protect them, to keep the plague from their eyes, from their doors. But those same John Q's are the first to stare wide-eyed and to point the finger of outrage when they see close up exactly what the job they've given the cops entails. Through political opportunism and ineptitude, the city had allowed the department to languish for years. Infected with political bacteria itself, the department was top-heavy with managers, while the ranks below were so thin that the dog soldiers out on the street rarely had the time or inclination to step out of their protective machines, their cars, to meet the people they served. They only ventured out to deal with the dirtbags, and consequently, Bosch knew, it had created a police culture in which everybody not in blue was seen as a dirtbag and was treated as such. You ended up with your Rodney Kings. You ended up with a riot the dog soldiers couldn't control. You ended up with a mural on a station house wall that was a damnable lie.
Up on Hollywood Boulevard, they have the Stars Walk of Fame. Here in front of the Hollywood police station, the stars are dedicated to the officers who have fallen in the line of duty. Russell Custer, who was killed in 1990, used to run the homicide table here. He was a cop's cop. In fact, he trained many of the detectives working homicide in the city still today. As a reporter, I would talk to Custer from time to time. I always enjoyed it. He seemed to be the kind of cop who was able to keep his humanity despite what he saw on the job. What happened to him underlined the happenstance of crime and violence in this community. Custer worked a full day here, working cases, and was simply just heading home. He stopped off for a drink at a bar in the Cahuenga Pass. There was a man at the bar who started a commotion. Custer stepped in to try to calm things down, and the next thing you know, the man pulled a gun. There was a gunfight, and both men fell to the ground, dead. Custer, a homicide detective, was a victim of homicide. His case was investigated by some of the men he had trained. Once more, it seemed to be a reminder that in this city, anything can happen at any time.
Rachel's plane landed a half hour late because of the rain and wind. It had not let up through the night, and the city was cast in a shroud of gray. It was the kind of rain that paralyzed the city. Traffic moved at a crawl on every street and every freeway. The roads weren't built for it. The city wasn't either. By dawn, the stormwater culverts were overflowing. The tunnels were at capacity, and the runoff to the Los Angeles River had turned the concrete-lined canal that snaked through the city to the sea into a roaring rapids. It was black water, carrying with it the ash of the fires that had blackened the hills the year before. There was an end-of-the-world gloom about it all. The city had been tested by fire first and now rain. Living in L.A., it sometimes felt like you were riding shotgun with the devil to the apocalypse.
Some years ago, another writer told me something that really struck home with me. He told me that the best detective novels are not about how a cop works on a case, but how a case works on a cop. There's a subtle but important difference there, and I try never to forget that.
Terry McCaleb had come to believe that homicide detectives, a breed of cop unto themselves, called upon deep inner emotions and motivations to accept and carry out the always difficult task of their job. There were usually two kinds: those who saw their jobs as a skill or a craft, and those who saw it as a mission in life. 10 years ago, he had put Bosch into the latter class. He was a man on a mission. This motivation in detectives could be broken down further as to what gave them this sense of purpose or mission. To some, the job was seen as almost a game. They had some inner deficit that caused them to need to prove they were better, smarter, and more cunning than their quarry. Their lives were a constant cycle of validating themselves by, in effect, invalidating the killers they sought by putting them behind bars. Others, while carrying a degree of that same inner deficit, also saw themselves with the additional dimension of being speakers for the dead. There was a sacred bond cast between the victim and cop that formed at the crime scene and could not be severed. It was what ultimately pushed them into the case and enabled them to overcome all obstacles in their path. McCaleb classified these cops as avenging angels. It had been his experience that these cop angels were the best investigators he ever worked with. He also came to believe that they traveled closest to the unseen edge beneath which lies the abyss. 10 years before, he had classified Harry Bosch as an avenging angel. He now had to consider whether the detective had stepped too close to that edge. He had to consider that Bosch might have gone over.
Los Angeles is a destination city. There's more people living here that came from somewhere else than there are people that were born here. They come here because they're looking to fulfill dreams and hopes that were unattainable in the places they were born. But it's like a big casino. The percentage of people who win is very small. And the line between those who are winners and losers, between those who get their goals achieved and those that don't, is where you find good stories. That's where the grist of good fiction is.
Hollywood was always best viewed at night. It could only hold its mystique in darkness. In sunlight, the curtain comes up, and the intrigue is gone, replaced by a sense of hidden danger. It was a place of takers and users, of broken sidewalks and dreams. You build a city in the desert, water it with false hopes and false idols, and eventually this is what happens. The desert reclaims it, turns it arid, leaves it barren. Human tumbleweeds drift across its streets. Predators hide in the rocks.
What I try to do in my stories is paint to all four corners of the canvas. I try to fill in all the spaces. In a way, I use the atmospherics of this place as a tool to show shadings of character and mood. Writing about Los Angeles, I think it's important because the sky says so much about this place and how we live here. It's a visual reminder or reflection of the cost of living here. There's that old saying about the eyes being a window into the soul of a person. Well, maybe with a city, or Los Angeles at least, it's the sky.
The setting sun burned the sky pink and orange in the same bright hues as surfers' bathing suits. It was beautiful deception, Bosch thought, as he drove north on the Hollywood freeway towards home. Sunsets did that here. Made you forget it was the smog that made their colors so brilliant. That behind every pretty picture there could be an ugly story.
Probably the strangest night I ever spent in Los Angeles was the second night of the riots in 1992. I was working as a reporter and I was assigned Hollywood Boulevard. And I watched a mob of people, multiracial, multi-ethnic, descend on Fredericks of Hollywood and break out the windows and go in there and loot the place. This is a place that sells underwear. Meantime, down the block, buildings were burning, and there were fire trucks all over the place and police, and people took the time to loot an underwear store. The surrealism of that just kind of always underlined the idea that Los Angeles in some dimension is a Hieronymus Bosch painting, a world gone wrong, a world of chaos. And that was one of the reasons why I used the name Hieronymus Bosch for one of my characters.
The tent had been closed since the earthquake, so Bosch stayed on the 405 until it rose over the Santa Monica Mountains and dropped into the valley. He took the long way because he thought it would be faster, and because he had a mail drop in Studio City that he had been using since the post office refused to deliver mail to a red tag structure. He transferred onto the 101 and promptly hit a wall of traffic, inching its way along the 6 lanes. He stayed with it until impatience got the better of him. He exited on Coldwater Canyon Boulevard and started taking surface streets. On Moorpark Road, he passed several apartment buildings that still hadn't been demolished or repaired. The red tags and yellow tape bleached near white by the months in the sun. Many of the condemned buildings still had signs like $500 moves you in and newly remodeled. On one red tag structure with the telltale crisscross stress fractures running along its entire length, someone had spray-painted a slogan that many took as the epitaph of the city in the months since the earthquake. The fat lady has sung. Some days it was hard not to believe it, but Bosch tried to keep the faith. Somebody had to. The newspaper said that more people were leaving than coming, but no matter, Bosch thought. I'm staying.
Back when I was a student, years before I came to Los Angeles, I studied the work of Hieronymus Bosch, the 15th century painter. Then many years go by, I ended up here in Los Angeles, and I started writing about this detective for the Los Angeles Police Department. And as I was writing, I was seeing correlations between what I was putting into my stories and what I was seeing happening in the city in the late 80s and early 90s, and what was in the paintings I had studied from Hieronymus Bosch. Bosch mostly created works that depicted a world gone wrong. They were all about the wages of sin. And that's when I came up with the idea that I would use the name Hieronymus Bosch because my detective, my character, was going to move across a similar landscape of a world gone wrong.
As the freeway rose to cross the Santa Monica Mountains in the Sepulveda Pass, McCaleb saw the Getty rise in front of him on the hilltop. The structure of the museum itself was as impressive as any of the great artworks housed within. It looked like a castle sitting atop a medieval hill. He saw one of the double trams slowly working its way up the side of the hill, delivering another group to the altar of history and art. By the time he parked at the bottom of the hill and caught his own tram ride up, McCaleb was 15 minutes late for his appointment. The world of Hieronymus Bosch was as striking to McCaleb as it was disturbing. The landscapes of misery were not unlike some of the most horrible crime scenes he'd witnessed. But in these painted scenes, the players were still alive and in pain. The gnashing of teeth and the ripping of flesh were active and real. His canvases were crowded with the damned, human beings tormented for their sins by visible demons and creatures given image by the hand of a horrible imagination. Dr. Voskuhler looked up at McCaleb and studied him in the way he had just been studying the painting. "An investigation?" he asked. "In regard to Hieronymus Bosch, is it?" "In a peripheral way," McCaleb answered. "I just want to learn what I can about him." "Well, no one is an expert on Bosch," Voskuhler said. "Tortured soul, tormented genius. How will we ever know what is truly in a man's heart?" McCaleb just nodded. Voskuhler turned and appraised the painting in front of him. "What do you see, Mr. McCaleb?" McCaleb looked at the painting and didn't answer for a long moment. It was a dark landscape depicting a village being burned to the ground in the night, while its inhabitants were being tortured and executed by a variety of otherworldly creatures. "I see a lot of pain." Voskuhler nodded approvingly. Then he stood and looked closely at the painting, flipping his glasses down and leaning closer to the upper quarter panel, his lenses just inches from the night sky above the burning village. "Bosch knew all the demons," he said. "The darkness." A long moment went by before he continued. "A darkness more than night."
Being a newspaper reporter makes you a quick study of a city. The nature of the job is that you go out into the streets and into places and neighborhoods that you'd normally never go. It makes you take the city in as a whole. And what it also does is make you either love the place or hate it. With me, I spent several years as a newspaper reporter here in Los Angeles, and I ended up loving the place. I remember going home from the night beat, driving home late at night and kind of feeling like I was a prince of the city. It was, a false feeling, but I always felt like I knew some of the secrets of the city and how it worked and how it didn't work. And those were important times for me, and hopefully some of those feelings I've carried over into the writing of my novels.
Parking on the little streets near the canals in Venice was non-existent. Bosch drove around looking for 10 minutes and ended up parking in the lot by the library out on Venice Boulevard and then walking back in. Not all of the dreamers drawn to Los Angeles came to make movies. Venice was the century-old dream of a man named Abbott Kinney. Before Hollywood and the film industry barely had a pulse, Kinney came to the marshlands along the Pacific. He envisioned a place built on a network of canals with arched bridges in a town center of Italian architecture. It would be a place emphasizing cultural and artistic learning, and he would call it Venice of America. But like most of the dreamers who come to Los Angeles, his vision was not uniformly shared or realized. Most financiers and investors were cynical and passed on the opportunity to build Venice, putting their money into projects of less grand design. Venice of America was dubbed Kinney's Folly. But a century later, many of the canals and the arched bridges reflected in their waters remained, while the financiers and doomsayers and their projects were long swept away by time. Bosch liked the idea of Kinney's Folly outlasting them all. Julia Brasher lived in a house at the corner of the Howland and Eastern Canals. Bosch expected it to be one of the newer structures that had replaced many of the bungalows in recent years. But as he came to the address, he saw that he was wrong. Her house was a small bungalow made of white clapboard, with an open front porch overlooking the joining of the two canals. Bosch stepped up onto the porch but hesitated before knocking on the door. He knew he had to be careful. Finally, he raised his arm and knocked. Julia answered right away. "I was wondering if you were going to knock or just stand out there." "You knew I was standing here?" "The porch is old. It creaks. I heard it."
Harry Bosch makes many of his personal discoveries while behind the wheel of his car. He grinds down the cases while he's driving. He finds the connections. Many of the key moments in his investigations occur in cars. This is a conscientious effort on my part to show this. I want to show the city through the windshield of his car.
Before dawn, Bosch was on the road. He left Julia Brasher sleeping in her bed and started on his way to his own home after stopping at Abbott's Habit for a coffee to go. Venice was like a ghost town, with the tendrils of the morning fog moving across the streets. But as he got closer to Hollywood, the lights of cars on the streets multiplied, and Bosch was reminded that the city of Bones was a 24-hour city.
This is the wheelhouse of the historic Angels Flight Railway. It's been one of the grace notes of this city for more than 100 years. We're at the top of Bunker Hill. Over the decades, it has changed pretty dramatically, but Angels Flight has remained the same. I think that's why I love it so much and why I build a whole book around this spot. In their own way, I want my books to be love letters to Los Angeles. Yes, I write about bad people and the bad things that happen, but I'm always looking for ways of showing the special places of this city. And so I often look for places like Angels Flight or the Bradbury Building, places that I think are unique and beautiful and help celebrate the city. With Angels Flight, I thought there were metaphors working on several levels. I mean, it's this graceful old piece of Los Angeles in the middle of all the glitz and glass and water of new LA, of the brand new Bunker Hill. I thought that was perfect for saying something about Harry and the city. On another level, I wanted to write a story about the city being at cross purposes, of people being at cross purposes, of contradictions, and the idea of these two trains crossing in the night was just perfect for that.
The plaza was the centerpiece of Bunker Hill, a stone courtyard formed by the conjoining of two marble office towers, a high-rise apartment building, and the art museum. There was a huge fountain and reflecting pond at its center, though the pumps and lights were off at this hour, leaving the water still and black. Past the fountain was the Beaux-Arts revival-styled station and wheelhouse of Angels Flight. It was next to this small structure that most of the investigators and patrol officers milled about as if waiting for something. Bosch and his partner stepped into the crowd and moved toward the top of the tracks. Bosch had ridden the incline railroad as a kid, studied how it worked. The two matching cars were counterbalanced. When one went up the side-by-side tracks, the other went down, and vice versa. They passed each other at the midpoint. Harry remembered riding on Angels Flight long before Bunker Hill had been reborn as a slick business center of glass and marble towers, classy condominiums and apartments, museums and fountains referred to as water gardens. Back then, the hill had been a place of once grand Victorian homes turned into tired-looking rooming houses. Harry and his mother had taken Angels Flight up the hill to look for a place to live.
What I try to do in my books is have them move forward and backward at the same time. You always want your story to move forward, to barrel forward with a lot of momentum, taking your reader along for the ride. But it's also very important to fill in the past, to give the backstory of your characters and the places he encounters. But I write crime novels. It's just not the kind of story where you can suddenly stop the momentum and take a trip down memory lane. So you have to find other ways of doing this. What I do is I try to find the special places and unique places of Los Angeles, and I use them as touchstones to the past. My characters encounter these places and they bring up memories in him or her, memories that help fill out the character and help fill out the character of the place, the city of Los Angeles.
The Bradbury was the dusty jewel of downtown. Built more than a century before, its beauty was old but still brighter and more enduring than any of the glass and marble towers that dwarfed it like a phalanx of brutish guards surrounding a beautiful child. Its ornate lines and glazed tile surfaces had withstood the betrayal of both man and nature. It had survived earthquakes and riots, periods of abandonment and decay, and a city that often didn't bother to safeguard what little culture and roots it had. Bosch believed there wasn't a more beautiful structure in the city. He had once taken the time to look up its history, found one of the more intriguing mysteries of Los Angeles. The Bradbury, for all its lasting glory, had been designed by a $5-a-week draftsman. George Wyman had no degree in architecture and no prior credits as a designer when he drew the plans for the building in 1892. Yet his design would see fruition in a structure that would last more than a century and cause generations of architects to marvel. To add to the mystery, Wyman never again designed a building of any significance, in Los Angeles or anywhere else. It was the kind of mystery Bosch liked. The idea of a man leaving his mark with the one shot he's given appealed to him. Across a whole century, Bosch identified with George Wyman. He believed in the one shot. He didn't know if he'd had his yet. It wasn't the kind of thing you knew and understood until you looked back over your life as an old man. But he had the feeling that it was still out there waiting for him. He had yet to take his one shot.
I know I write about the dark side or the underside. I write about the crimes of lost people. I take the reader on journeys into darkness. But believe it or not, I want to balance that with what I love about Los Angeles. I want to celebrate Los Angeles. I want to show the grace notes that I know are here and that I know can bring light to that darkness.
Through the windows behind the large polished wood desk, Bosch could see the face of Anthony Quinn. It was part of a mural depicting the actor with arms outstretched on a brick wall of a building across the street from the Bradbury. The mural is called The Pope of Broadway, he told Ryder. He's watching over all the homeless around here. Bosch stepped closer to the window and looked down. He saw the forms of two homeless people sleeping beneath blankets of newspapers beneath the mural. The mural was one of the little things that made him like downtown so much. Just like the Bradbury and Angel's Flight, little pieces of grace were everywhere if you looked.
This is Mulholland Drive. Some people say it's the backbone of the city. The Santa Monica Mountains cut the city in half, and Mulholland Drive rides along the crest of it. It's a lot like the city. It's beautiful, but very dangerous.
At Mulholland Drive, we turned right and followed the road as it snaked along the mountain crest, offering views through the darkening haze of the valley below. We serpentined for nearly a mile until we saw Wrightwood Drive and turned left and descended into a neighborhood of small homes built on steel pylons, their weight hanging out over the mountain's edge, precarious testaments to engineering and the desires of developers to leave their mark on every crest in the city.
I write about characters involved in extraordinary circumstances who rise to extreme levels. These are people completely unlike me. But the irony of what I do is that I can't help but seed these characters with my worldview. Bits of pieces of me end up in my characters. When I first started writing about Harry Bosch, I wanted him to be completely different from me. He was out here and I was over here. But as the story began and as the stories continued, I think we got closer and closer together.
The sun was going down and the sky was the color of ripe pumpkin with slashes of phosphorescent pink. It was beautiful, and even the clutter of billboards up and down the Sunset Strip looked beautiful to me. I was back out on the balcony trying to think, trying to figure things out. I looked at the Marlboro Man, his crinkled eyes and stoic chin unchanged by time. He'd always been one of my heroes, an icon. No matter that he was always as shallow as a magazine page or a billboard sign. I remember being at the dinner table, my position every night always to my father's right. Him always smoking, and the ashtray always to the right of his plate. Me learning to smoke by virtue of that. He looked like the Marlboro Man to me, my father. Back then, at least.
When I write about Harry Bosch, I hope I'm writing about Los Angeles. My hope is, or my idea is, that if I write about one person's journey through this place, of his experiences assimilating and understanding this place, I'll be touching something in my readers, and that will work whether they know Los Angeles or not.
The house still smelled of fresh paint when Bosch finally got home. He looked at the wall he had started to paint 3 days before, and it seemed long ago. He didn't know when he would finish now. The house had been a ground-up rebuilding job after the earthquake. He'd only been back a few weeks after more than a year of living in a residence hotel near the police station. The earthquake, too, seemed long ago. Things happened fast in this city. Everything but the moment seemed like ancient history. He got himself a beer from the refrigerator and went out to the back deck. The new deck was larger than its predecessor and offered a deeper view into the pass. It was dark and peaceful out. The usual hiss of the Hollywood freeway far below was easily tuned out. He watched the spotlights from Universal Studios cut across the starless sky.
You know that saying that home is where the hearth is? Well, for Harry Bosch, his deck is his hearth. What he sees when he stands out there and looks out at the city, that's kind of the fireplace by which he warms himself.
He had black coffee on the back deck while watching the silent city come awake. There was a crisp chill in the air, and the earthy smell of eucalyptus was rising from the tall trees down in the pass. The marine fog layer had filled the pass, and the hills were just mysterious silhouettes in the mist. He watched the morning begin for nearly an hour, fascinated by the show he had from his deck.
Like the windshield of his car, the back deck of Harry Bosch's house is meant to be a window on Los Angeles. It's a place for him to contemplate his city and his place in it. By specific design through the books, it's become a place where all the different machinations of character and plot seem to come together. So far through the books, there's been great violence, there's been great moments of love, but most of all, I think it's been the place where Harry's hope for the city comes out the most. I think it's really the place where when he's at the deck, often at the end of a book, and he's contemplating his city, that his true love for this place comes out.
I stood on the porch, elbows on the railing, for a long time after she left. My guess was that I would never see her again, and I felt a loss. I felt like something good had been taken from me before I really knew how good it could be. I tried to put her out of my mind for a little while. I looked out at the city and thought it was beautiful. The rain had cleaned the sky out, and I could see all the way to the San Gabriels and the snow-covered peaks beyond. The air seemed to be as clean and pure as the air breathed by the Indians and the Padres so many years before. I saw what they had seen in the place. It was the kind of day you felt you could build a future on.
And now it's my distinct pleasure to welcome the Chief of Police for the City of Los Angeles, William J. Brett.
Good morning on this beautiful Los Angeles morning. Before beginning my brief remarks, I'd like to comment on two of my guests, a little more explanation of why they're here. Dave Nichols, Vice President of the SBC Company, has also the duties and responsibilities as the leader of the Police Foundation. It's an organization that was formed a number of years ago to support the needs of this department that could not be met with our city budget. Last year, under his leadership, that organization raised almost $2 million for this department. It buys equipment for the organization ranging from the trauma kits that are in the trunk of every one of our police vehicles. They're in the process of acquiring a new modular training center for our helicopter unit. They have recently bought over 200 cellular BlackBerry phones for our senior lead officers. We thank him and his organization for their continuing partnership with this department. Additionally, Michael Connelly, introduced as an author. He is an award-winning author of a series of novels, many of them featuring a fictional Los Angeles police detective, Harry Bosch, assigned to the Hollywood division. Harry, in the last novel, like over 900 Los Angeles police officers who were so frustrated with conditions in this department that they left, I'm trying to encourage Mr. Connelly to encourage Detective Bosch to return to the department in the next novel as a sign of faith in the reorganization of the organization. We've had over 150 men and women who left who have returned to our ranks. So hopefully we might be able to encourage Detective Bosch to also come back.